Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England, whose purpose is to uncover and promote authors with new ideas to society's oldest problems, especially economic ones. Hello, today we have an unusual situation as we're releasing the near unedited recording of the conversation with Dave Wetzel, one of our contributors for the second edition of Taken for a Ride, and lifelong campaigner for fairness, justice, and a better transport system for London. Now, Dave sadly passed away a few months ago, and his family held an extraordinarily well-attended memorial celebration of his life earlier this month. It was wonderful to hear stories of how Dave had taken on the system to improve people's lives, but also how so many people said he'd positively impacted their lives individually. Now, quite a few of the stories that we had to edit out of the original podcast designed to promote the book came up in stories people shared on the day, so we thought it might be enjoyable for his friends at least to see Dave in his unedited glory. So that's what we have today, over 1 hour of Dave telling stories about his life and how he sought to make a difference both in transforming a city he loved and also how much he cared for and cared about his friends. It was a privilege to work with him, albeit briefly.
Hello. Hi. Now, it don't seem to be showing me, does it? Can you see me? I can't.
No, I can't.
I don't know what I do to do that. Let's have a look. Scroll down.
The video image on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, if the camera's plugged in, it should just be turn on camera.
Yeah, I can't see the bottom of the screen. That's the trouble. Let me try moving it all up, which is done. Start video.
There we go.
There we go. One horrible old man.
You look like a retired pop star, mate.
I wish I were. I could do with the money. But I do drive the Rolls Royce. Fred Harrison got me into Rolls Royces.
Did he really? Right.
Did you know he used to have a roller?
No.
On the basis that it held its value, and although you spent more on petrol, you saved a lot on depreciation. But I think, I better switch that light off behind my head. Hang on a sec. Yeah, it was when he resigned from a newspaper. I think it was the Daily Sport or something like that, when it was taken over from Murdoch by the man that ended up owning the Express. And he made his money out of naughty magazines. And the day he took over, Fred resigned on the basis that he didn't mind working for Murdoch, who was a crook, but he wasn't going to work for a pornographer. And he sat in his garden talking to me on the phone, saying, I've got no job, I've got a Rolls Royce, and I can't remember the rest. Oh, my neighbour's cat is trying to come in.
Dave, is there any way we could get the image to be stable? Could it rest on a table or something?
Oh, okay. Yeah, something to that. I have a little table here, which I'll remove some of the rubbish.
Yeah, that's fine. So,
let me show you. I don't suppose you would recognise that man.
No, I don't.
Dr. Sayat Sen. Have you heard of Sayat Sen?
No.
Did you ever see the film about the boy emperor of China? And he was the last emperor of China. He ended up as a gardener. And Sun Yat-sen was the first Republican president about, I'm going to say 1912. I could be out plus or minus. And he you've heard of Shanghai Shek, the leader of the Kuomintang. Well, Dr. Sun Yat-sen started the Kuomintang, and he was a supporter of Henry George, and their policy was land value tax. And when they took over Formosa and renamed it Taiwan, he was long dead. He died in the 1920s, but Chiang Kai-shek carried on with the land value tax. And as far as I know, Taiwan still has the land value tax today. And it was, I always thought my dad was an old Georgist. And I always thought my dad invented the idea that you don't need to value land. You just tell landowners, you tell us the value of your land, and we'll either tax you on it, on that value, or we will buy it from you at that value. So they're in a funny situation. If it's too high, then they'll pay a high tax. If it's too low, the government will buy it and they won't get a fair price for it. So it puts them, they try and give you an accurate valuation. But it wasn't it might have been coincidental. My dad came up with it, but it was this Dr. Sun Yat-sen I've discovered since. I think I discovered it when I visited his museum in Shanghai. He has a museum because the communists thought highly of him, even though he was the other side, as it were, in the Civil War. But there was no civil war between them and the communists when he died in the 1920s. The communists used to be members of the Kuomintang, and then they were expelled, probably in the early 30s. And that's when they started fighting each other. So during what we call our war, Second World War, it was a three-way fight. It was the Kuomintang, the communists, and the Japanese all fighting in China. And the Kuomintang lost after the Japanese were defeated by the Americans, and the Kuomintang took over Taiwan, much to the horror of many original Taiwanese people, Formosians. The other thing on that shelf, this is a very bad description or picture. Don't think you'll be able to make it out. You might just be able to make it out. See what it says?
Is it the land value game, is it? Or
yeah, the Landlord's game. And this is about 1903. Wow. And Parker claimed it was invented in 1931, not as the Landlord's game, but as Monopoly. But you can see the board is all very similar, not identical to Monopoly.
Yes.
I'm trying to read some of the things. But you've got public utilities, all the different squares, probably the same number. You haven't got the stations, but you've got land to pay taxes. Land on this one, you pay taxes. And on that game, they shared the money out. Instead of paying rent to an individual, you paid rent to the public purse, and the public purse. So there were no winners. Everybody won, which we would expect if we collected land value tax. So it's quite an interesting game. Now, is that far enough away, or?
Yeah, we've got a light challenge. So at the moment, with the light coming through the
curtain.
If you're able to,
I'll pull both curtains, and then it's probably going to be, is that, oh, I haven't got the wall lights on. Let me put the wall lights on. And I've got a big light to the left. I could switch that light off or direct it differently.
I think there's more about, I would say it's more about the image quality actually, but we can just go with the sound.
Yeah. Thank God for that.
Were you able to send a recentish picture?
No, I haven't got one. The only one I had, which is quite nice, but it's a few years old, is in a magazine. Now, I don't know if there's problems of copyright or what have you, but it was a big article about me in a magazine. I can pull it out and show it.
But would need to message the copyright holder to make sure that was all right.
It was a magazine for Scania lorries.
Right.
And they did a spread on me. And there's several. There's that picture, me in front of some buses.
Oh, brilliant.
As you can see, I was a lot younger and better looking in those days. And that's a nice one because I'm smiling in that one.
Yeah, lovely.
I don't know. I could try getting hold of these people. I don't know the date of the magazine. It's probably about 50 years ago. Not literally, but there's a telephone number I could ring and see if they've still got that original and try and get that original to you. Otherwise, my daughter's got a good camera on her phone, and I could stand outside somewhere in daylight, perhaps in my garden or hers, and get her to do a decent photo of me currently. But I don't like looking at myself as I am now.
What? So,
You'll get to 81 young one day with a bit of luck. I'm just wondering if I'll get to 82 now.
yeah, fingers crossed, mate. So Dave, I wondered if you're been. I know you're in. I mean, looking at the postscript that you've written and just some of your background, I just wonder for the listeners if you could just tell us what you did during your professional career at the time when you met with Don and became friends.
Well, when I first met Don, it was, as far as I recall, was in Bournemouth. It was probably the late 1990s. It was at a conference. Professionally, I was running in Cornwall what I would call an antique shop, but if you'd seen it, you'd have called it a junk shop. And I was given a presentation on the law of rent, and I was actually using chairs as a way of showing differential rent. And Don was talking about the effects that the Jubilee Line had on his land values. And I don't know why, but we became sort of friends as a result of that first meeting. And our politics were totally different. I went on after that to be vice chair of Transport for London. I had already been in the 1980s the chair of the GLC Transport Committee when Ken Livingstone was leader of the Greater London Council, and I did it for the whole 5 years of his administration. The only reason I went on the GLC, I'd had a background in politics and trade unionism and the cooperative movement. And Ken had approached me in the late 70s when I was candidate for the Labour Party in the 1979 general election in what was for the Labour Party the hopeless seat of Twickenham, which is now a Lib Dem seat. And Ken asked me to stand for the GLC, and I said, "Oh, no way! They're all stuffed shirts wearing pinstripe suits. That doesn't interest me at all." And he said, "No, Dave, we're going to have a revolution, and you've got to be part of it." And that's how I got involved in the GLC. I won a Tory seat at Hammersmith and got elected. And then at our first meeting, I was elected as chair of the Transport Committee, which surprised me really because my desire was to be vice chair of the staff committee because of my trade union background. But it transpired that Tony Banks, who we'd lined up to be chair of the Transport Committee, for various reasons, switched to arts and recreation, and that left a vacancy. Long story how I got it. I'll save you that. But anyway, for 5 years, I was chair of the Transport Committee at the GLC. Then the GLC was abolished by Thatcher in 1986, and I got elected to Hounslow Council again. I'd already been a councillor when I was 21 years old, and the following year I became leader of the council, and I did that for 4 years. Then when that all finished, I went down to Cornwall with my wife. We ran this junk shop and also a restaurant. And then we moved back to London, opened the restaurant in Brentford, and Ken came to write a review for the Evening Standard, and he asked me to get involved in his campaign for mayor, which I was happy to do. And then for 8 years, he appointed me as vice chair of TfL. He chaired Transport for London. Transport for London runs the underground, the buses, registers taxis, in charge of all the major streets in London, gives grants to borough councils for road safety. And in fact, what we did, we were setting up Transport for London from 16 different separate agencies. And we introduced the congestion charge, much to the annoyance of many motorists. But, and of course, there were all words of doom and gloom if it was to be introduced. A bit like the words of doom and gloom we get about if we have land value tax. And, but it was success from day one, and it's still there today after a Tory mayor and now a right-wing Labour mayor. It still continues. That was probably our biggest success, but I pride myself on the improvement to buses, particularly in that first year. I was chairman of London Buses, and we introduced 33 major changes. I won't bore you with telling you what all 33 were, but it was things like doubling the night bus network, improving the information, particularly timetables at bus stops, improving countdown, having it available on people's mobile phones, integrating the fares with Oyster. So anyway, 33 improvements we made to the bus services. Having 2 doors on buses, it seems so obvious now. You have a door for people getting on and a separate door for people getting off. most of the buses we inherited in 2000 were single-door buses, and you couldn't board the bus until the people had alighted. And, of course, that delayed the bus at the bus stop and made the journey longer than it needed to be. Now, of course, with cashless buses, and we made the first moves towards it, it's much quicker at the bus stop. People just get on, flash their Oyster card or their credit card, and board more quickly. So buses do move more quickly. And also bus lanes, that was bus priority generally, and particularly bus lanes. But anyway, we increased bus patronage dramatically as a result of that. And that was our second major achievement after the introduction of congestion charging. And Boris got elected, unfortunately, as Mayor of London in 2008. Boris Johnson, I refer to. And I was honoured by being the first person that he sacked. But during the whole of that period, I was in touch with Don Riley. I used to get invited to the Christmas parties he put on for his tenants, which were quite a dramatic affair, with Don dressing up in various costumes and bouncing from table to table in his way in short trousers and holding a gun, I remember, on one occasion. But he was a real character who, if you read the book, he came from New Zealand. I think he had about 5 shillings in his pocket when he came to London, and became multi-millionaire. And he said he became a millionaire not through his efforts, but the efforts of everybody else in London whose work, activities, building better transport systems, particularly the Jubilee Line extension, added to the value of his land. But it was almost an accident that he became a landlord. He had a business dealing with computers in Russia, and it needed more space, so he rented very cheaply, or he bought, I think, very cheaply, a warehouse-type building in Southwark, and it was too much space for his little business. And so he rented the rest out, and it was only within a couple of years he realised he was making more money on the rents than he was on his Russian computer business. So he sold that and concentrated on acquiring more properties, very astutely, very successfully, but recognising all the time that it wasn't just his efforts that he was making money. It was because of the efforts of everybody living and working in London.
So, I mean, I know you say in the postscript about Don saying that we agree on more than we disagree, and you're saying how different you were politically, and you talk there about, you know, as a kid growing up in the north of England, all I knew about Ken Livingstone was he was Red Ken, and he was probably one of the most vilified politicians in the UK, but from the press point of view. But one of the things that stands out for me is just how practical the improvements were that you made to the buses, and they would have, you know, they would have improved the community for everybody. And that's certainly, my politics was certainly not didn't match Ken Livingstone's, but the improvements there to the city would be marked, wouldn't they? Really.
Well, Ken always described me as being to the left of him, so that gives you an idea what my politics are. I voted against Ken on 3 occasions in the council chamber, and on each occasion I was taking a position that was more left, against cuts and things like that. But I love Ken Livingstone. We still get together once a month and have a meal, two old codgers sitting in a corner of a Hampstead restaurant and watch the world go by and discuss things. But he loves me recalling the old stories, and he himself every other year reads his own autobiography because he's forgotten most of this stuff. And when he's reading it, he says to himself, crikey, did I really do that? Or did I really do this? But he's a lovely man. I love him very much.
Right. And when you look at the success of the book, how surprised were you that it's had such an impact?
Well, I think it's like most things. If the message is true and it's backed by facts, then it's bound to have an impact. Many of us promoted it in our own ways. Whenever I gave a speech on transport, and I've given many, many speeches around the country and indeed around the world on most continents, I always had a slide with Don Riley and Taken for a Ride and mention the effects of the Jubilee Line, and always quote, I hope correctly, his figures, whereby, according to his back of the envelope exercise on land values, limited to just 1,000 yards around every station of the 11 new stations on the Jubilee Line extension, the land values rose by £13 billion. And if memory serves me right, the cost of building the Jubilee Line was £3.2 billion. So just the land values within 1,000 yards of each of the new stations, the land value would have increased in land value, would have paid for at least 3 new Jubilee Line extensions. And to me, that was always a dramatic part of the story I would tell when talking about transport to academics, to people in national government, people in local government, journalists, transport practitioners, whoever and wherever I could find an audience. And those numbers tend to stick. It's a very dramatic, and it's a conservative estimate, the total increase in land value. One, because rightly, Don took it from 1992, when the Jubilee Line was first passed through Parliament, to when it was opening. And of course, those land values have increased because of the Jubilee Line ever since. And also the catchment area is much wider, where, for example, Thamesmead is linked by bus on a 30-minute bus ride to North Greenwich Jubilee Line station. That increased land values in Thamesmead in southeast London, but that wouldn't show in Don's figures or Don's book because it was outside the 1,000-yard catchment area. And anybody that could commute by bus to one of those stations, land owners in those areas were increasing their rents. Of course, the farther you get away from the Jubilee Line, both in terms of mileage, but more in terms of time taken to get there, that increase in value decays until eventually there is no increase because people make alternative travel arrangements. But Don's figures are a dramatic conservative number, and I think we should all remember that when we're talking about Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth Line, the Docklands Light Railway, which I was midwife to at the GLC. I struck the deal by which the railway was to be built with government and with the Docklands Development Corporation and with London Transport. Again, that's another long story I won't bore you with. But briefly, they wanted to have a fully automatic railway. And I wanted a guard on every train who could drive the train in emergency. And we came to a deal, yes, they could have their fully automatic train service, but we would have a train captain on every train. The railway would be fully accessible for people with disabilities. I think 1981 was the UN year for disabled people, and it was very right and proper we should build that in, and it was the first mass transit system in this country that had full access for people with disabilities. And I also didn't want it to be just a businessman's railway linking Canary Wharf with the City of London, which was the original intention, but to make it a railway that local people should have local stops where they could get on and off. And so that was the deal we struck. It was a very tight budget. I described it as a toy town railway at the time, but it did have dramatic effects. And what originally we spent about £77 million building now has been extended and expanded, partly because of Ken Livingstone when he was mayor, going to City Airport and things. It's ended up as a cost of over £1 billion with the extensions, and nobody would do without it today. Yet again, it was controversial at the time, and the Thatcher government really didn't want to spend money on it, which is why they limited us to this £77 million, which created all sorts of problems that I won't bore you with. But I chaired every consultation meeting we had regarding that railway, and I struck the first bit of dirt to be dug with a silver spade to start the building of the railway. And yet, when it was opened in 1987, I think, a year after the GLC was abolished, and I was then leader of Hounslow Council, I wasn't even invited to the opening of the railway. And I refused to travel on it because I'm one of these pugnacious people, until when I was director of a transport charity for people with disabilities, now called Transport for All. I was invited by the then Minister for Transport, the Tory Minister of Transport, to go for a ride on the railway, and that was first time I ever rode on it.
Who was the minister?
Name, I forget. I can look it up. I can't remember. But what I argued at the GLC, before we actually planned the stations, I said, when we've decided where the stations are going to be, we should buy all the land around those stations that we possibly can, and then rent it out afterwards to pay for the operating costs of the railway and to subsidise the building of the railway. And that was dismissed on the grounds that the GLC did not have the powers to use compulsory purchase orders to buy the land in order to be a land speculator. So we just left it for everybody else to be the land speculators, and the taxpayer picked up the bill. Same story as the Jubilee Line extension. But fortunately, some of that story got from Don Riley's book, got into the Treasury, because we, as TfL, went to the Treasury to fund Crossrail. And Gordon Brown, when he was in charge of the Treasury, kept saying no. And maybe it was perchance that Alistair Darling took over. We were suggesting a site value rating or a local land value tax just for London to pay for the building of Crossrail. And the Labour government said they did not want a new tax on landowners. So Bob Kiley, who was our transport commissioner from America, he'd run the New York railway system and the Boston railway system. He and his experts looked at the current business rating system, and we went back to Alistair Darling and suggested that we should put a levy on the most expensive buildings paying business rates. And if I'm right, at the time we were talking about a 2.5% levy on buildings with a rateable value over £49,000, so per annum. So, and that's probably going back to values years gone by. So we were talking about buildings that were worth many millions of pounds, paying 2.5% extra levy. And interestingly enough, none of the owners of those buildings protested. None of them demurred from the idea of making this contribution, because they knew for every pound that they paid in extra business rates, they were going to make tens of pounds from the rents they could charge the tenants who rented the buildings from them.
Exactly what Stephen Norris said about when the Treasury came back to him when he was trying to get funding for the Jubilee Line extension, when the guys building Canary Wharf went bankrupt. They said, "Oh, you got to find another. I think it was 350 or 400 million, and you got to get it from the new landlords." And he just knew for a fact that they would pay it up, because without it, it was worth nothing, and with it, it was worth over $1 billion back then. And it's exactly the same story, that they knew how much whilst they complained publicly about the cost of public investments in transport links, good, well-designed ones, they know for a fact that they're gonna make out like bandits, right?
Yeah, many transport experts and transport academics, make two mistakes. One is they say you build a new railway and land values will go up. And that is a mistake. It's only if you build a new railway that is well designed and people will want to use either for transport or freight that land values will increase. You could build a railway in the middle of the Sahara Desert where there's no oil, no population, and it goes from Oasis A to Oasis Z, and it wouldn't make an iota difference to the land value because nobody would want to use it. It's only if you build something that people will want to use. And the Department for Transport made that mistake when they tried to value the increased land value from the Croydon tram network. Of course, there's a huge difference between a train that takes maybe 120 people and operates every 10 minutes to the Jubilee Line extension, which takes, 12 to 1,500 people and operates every 2 minutes. You cannot compare the two and expect to get the same increase in land value from both projects. And the other mistake that academics and others make is to value the increase in land values and this was done in Australia, where I think it's called the Gold Coast Line. They built a light transit line, and an academic at the local university showed there was an increase in land value as a result of that line, but it was infinitesimal. And of course, the mistake they made, they valued the baseline at the day the railway opened and compared that with the increase in land value to the day they were doing the study. But by the time the railway opens, a huge, massive amount of land speculation has already taken place. In fact, the day they announced they're going to build a railway 5 or 10 years hence, land values start rising because immediately the speculators move in and the landowners see a higher demand for their land, and so the price goes up. So most of the speculation takes place before the railway is built. And then the other thing is, it's not a one-off hit. And I recently spoke to transport experts in Manchester who were talking about Salford Quays, and they've missed the one-off hit increase in land value. And I said, yeah, but that increase is going to continue every year, year after year after year. And you can collect it. You don't have to say, well, we've written off that, we can't collect it, the land value anymore. The important thing is, if you open a railway like Jubilee Line extension, the increase in land values will remain for years, and those higher rents will remain for years as long as the railway runs. If you close the railway, then presumably the opposite happens. I would have liked somebody to have done research on Beeching when the Tory government under the road millionaire who was Minister of Transport at the time closed railway lines all across Britain. I would wonder what effect that had on those land values because the railway link was closed. Now, obviously, if it was a railway that wasn't being used at all, one, it should be closed or it should be promoted and better, cheaper fares encourage people to use it. But you wouldn't expect it to have any change. But it was a reasonably well-used railway by the local community, and it closed, and many of them were because people protested at the time. I would have expected land values to have gone down. And it's just a shame that nobody had the foresight to do any studies to find out what effect all that had.
And you're talking there about the decisions that governments make that either take away value from the community or add it. And when you look at Don's work and his book, which are the ideas that you think are still most relevant today?
Well, land value tax is the main relevant idea coming. That if we as a community create increased land value, and indeed we as a community create all land value, and so therefore we as a community should collect that land value instead of collecting taxes through income tax or taxes through taxes on trade such as VAT and sales taxes, or even taxes on profits. If you look at most profits that private companies make, perhaps not most, but a lot of it derives from land value.
So, in your opinion, then, what do you think people will get from reading Don's book, especially the revised version?
I believe it's an education. It's entertaining. Don's own life story itself is entertaining, but it's also an education. And what is written is nothing novel, nothing unique, nothing that wasn't already buried in economic textbooks and buried on the internet that people couldn't pick up for themselves. But he distills it into this one major story. And he says some beautiful phrases. I'm not quoting directly from the book, but from memory. Things like he described how the building of the Jubilee Line extension, the contractors needed premises to work from. And he rented one of his buildings to these contractors. And he asked, could he go down at night into the tunnel to see what they were doing? And they were only too proud and too happy to show him. So he spent an evening down in the tunnel, and he describes how these men, and they were all men in those days, were digging this tunnel, making it longer and longer, and they were sweating. They were only paid a reasonable wage for the work they were doing. They didn't even know where their next job would come from when that was completed. But all the time they were sweating and working, his land holdings in Southwark were rising in value in his sleep. And he wasn't having to lift a penny. In fact, he was gaining from it because he could charge rent for their use of his premises. And he describes how that was all most unfair. He could make money in his sleep. And he wasn't the first to say that. I think I might be wrong, but Winston Churchill described landowners making money in their sleep while the rest of the community worked to enable that increase in land value.
Wow, what a story. David, and then like you'd like to say to our listeners before we wrap up?
I would urge people to read Don Riley's book, Taken for a Ride, whether they're particularly interested in transport or not. Think of the lesson in the broader sense, not just looking for the increase in land values that do arise on good, well-used transport projects, but to also think about it in terms of good schools. Parents pay more for a house in the catchment area of a good school. That increase in value isn't because of the bricks and mortar are worth anymore. It's the location close to a good school. People will pay more for a lovely view of the countryside, or hopefully without flooding, to be near a river, or without the cliff collapsing, to have views of the sea. Well, it's not the landowner that has created the river, the countryside, or the sea. That is nature. And the fact that they're given a planning permission to put up a house is a community decision. The fact that there's a legal system that we pay for that gives them the entitlement to their deeds to actually hold that land free of other people claiming ownership to it is a community decision. And those landowners should be funding all the services that are needed, the legal system, the transport services, the keeping the river clean, maintaining the flood barriers, all of the services, our health service, our education services, our welfare services, should all be funded from land wealth, which is a much, much bigger amount than any economist will admit to. And I would suggest it is a huge part of GDP, much more than just the taxes we currently pay. And so my message to any person, specialist or preferably general readers, is to read the book and learn the wider lesson, and then to actively call for your MPs, your councillors, your elected government. Demand, not just call for, but demand as a human right, as a point of justice. Say none of these landowners created the planet on which we live. Demand that the wealth of land which is created by all should be shared by all, and we shouldn't be penalised by having the government, the inland revenue, stealing our money from our wage packets even before we've taken the money home or before we've even opened our bank account to see what's been credited. It's vitally important we do that. And the benefits, I don't believe are just economic benefits. Obviously, I argue there are economic benefits. I wouldn't be doing it if there weren't. But I think the benefits are much, much wider than economic. They're social benefits. They're community adhesion benefits. We do live in a society. Despite Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, we do live in communities. And we can, by sharing the wealth that Mother Nature provides, I believe our feelings for the community can be that much greater. Our activity in community activity can be much greater. If we have land value tax, the economic benefits will not only be less tax to pay, but I see a society where we won't have workers pleading for jobs. We'll have employers pleading for workers. And workers will be in a much better bargaining position in terms of holidays, in terms of maternity and paternity leave, in terms of pensions, in terms of hours worked, than they currently are. And employers will be able to afford, because of land value tax, not paying huge amounts for the land value of the sites on which they run their businesses to private individuals, and on top of that, having to pay huge amounts in taxation. They'll be able to afford to provide these better benefits and to pay these higher wages. I look forward to the day when all workers are on a 3-day week, let alone a 4-day week, and they're getting paid more money than they are now. And I envisage machines taking over the boring jobs and the dirty jobs that we don't want to do, and us having jobs that are more artistic, more into sport, more doing the things in life that we want to do, rather than leaving them just for a few hours after we're knackered working 5 days a week, 36 or 40 hours a week.
Amazing. Well, Dave, just to paraphrase or to quote Don, I'm sure some of our listeners may disagree with some of the things that you've said, but I'm certain that they agree on more than we disagree. So your passion and your intelligence and your commitment to society and making things better is evident in our conversation. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to anybody who's taken the trouble to see this.
Thanks for that. It was brilliant.
Oh, I'm glad you're satisfied. I'm sorry about the image.
Yeah, no problem. We can, well, I don't think we'll be able to sort it, but we can certainly, it's good sound quality. So that's the key thing with the podcast. So we're all good there.
I've got lots of stories I used to tell on the public platform to try and, because I don't think people are moved by economic numbers.
No.
I think people are moved by stories.
Yeah.
And I've heard some wonderful stories which I retell. There was an old man in America at one of the CGO conferences, and I think it was Bill Batts was chairing an open mic session, and he said, I'm an academic, and I teach my students land value tax and the law of rent. And I wonder if anybody's got an easier way or a more receptive way of telling the same thing. And this elderly gentleman, probably my age now, and this is about 30 years ago, I suppose, struggled through the rostrum using 2 walking sticks. He had 2 hearing aids. I'm trying to remember his name, and I can't for the life of me remember. I used to put it on the bottom of the slide that I used on the PowerPoint. It'll come to me sometime. And he said, I live in a small town in America. Oh, yeah, the conference, I think it was in London, Ontario, this conference. He said, I come from a small town in America. And he said, I tell people about economic rent, and I don't use the word economic, and I don't use the word rate. I just tell them a story of a factory owner coming to our town wanting to build a new factory. And he goes to the realtor, the American estate agent, and he says to her what size piece of land he wants. And she says, oh, that's good. I've got a piece of land exactly that size on my books. Come with me. So they get into her automobile. They drive out of town on the freeway. They drive on some local roads. They drive along a dirt track. And eventually, after about half an hour drive, they get to this field with a big sign on it, says for sale. She says, now this field is exactly the size that you need for your factory. And he looks at it, he says, how much is it? She says, oh, it's $10,000. And he looks again, he starts squinting his eyes. He says, I can't see any houses nearby. Are there houses just beyond that little hill over there? She said, oh no, there's no houses within miles of this field. He said, I can't see any other roads other than the dirt track we just come down. Is there a lovely good road the other side of the hill? She said, no, there's no roads. That's the only access. He said, is there a railway nearby that I could use. She said, no, there's no railway. He said, well, I like the price. He said, I can well afford $10,000, but honestly, it's not any use to me. He said, I've got to be able to bring the machinery in that I'm going to have in the factory. I've got to bring in the materials to build the factory. I've got to bring in the raw materials when the factory's working. I've got to take the materials away from the factory. Workers have got to come here every day. He said, I even run a factory gate shop. He said, I want customers to be able to come here. He said, unfortunately, it's really no use to me. I might have to look at another town. And she said, no. Thinking about it, she says, I've got another site, this same size. She says, let's go and look at that. So they drive down the dirt track onto the local road, back on the freeway, right into the middle of the suburbs of the town. And she says, and they come across this site. It had a building on it. It's all been demolished. So, oh, and that was the other thing. He asked about energy. Was there electricity, gas, or power of any sort, water, sewage, and it had none of that. But this has all these things. He looks around and he says to her, okay, he said, this looks nice. He said, is there housing nearby? She said, oh, yeah, just there. She said, there's several estates. Some are privately owned, some are rented. Lots of people live around here. He said, is there any transport? She said, oh, yeah, very good transport. The buses are up and down all the time. There's a rail station. There's a freight yard. She said, excellent transport by this site. He said, is there power, electricity, gas, water, sewage? All that exists on this site. It's already laid on. She says, all the services are good. She says, people like living in the town here, this part of town here, because there's an excellent school. It's always top of its league. She says, and the fire service here is so good, the fire brigade even arrives before the fires even started. And she says, there's an excellent hospital. He said, this is ideal. This is what I want. This is what I need. He said, I'll pay $10,000 for this. And she said, oh, no, it's not $10,000. He said, but you said it's the same size. She said, yes, it is the same size, but think about all these wonderful services: school, the fire brigade, the hospital, the roads, the railway, the sewerage, the water, all these services laid on. The power's already here. He said, yes, you're right. It is worth more to me than that other side. So how much is it? She said, it's $100,000. It says 100,000. Well, yeah, I suppose it is worth it. As he says it, he pulls out his checkbook. And as I'm telling the story, I pull out my checkbook from my pocket. And he says, so to whom do I write the check? Is it to the water board? Is it to the local authority for the roads? Is it to the electricity company? Is it to the gas company? Is it to the school board? Is it to the police department? Is it to the fire brigade? She said, no. You don't pay it to any of those agencies. You pay it to the owner who's selling you the land. And he says, oh, I've got it. He keeps the 10,000 and he gives 90,000 to all these other agencies. She says, no, not at all. She says, he lives in the town, but he's going to retire down in Florida. And he's going to use the 100,000 to buy his retirement home and to pay for his living down in Florida. So he says, well, that doesn't seem fair. He says, I've got to pay him £100,000 because of all these services, and yet I've also got to pay. Sorry, I left a bit. How do you pay for all these services? Oh, we tax you. And he says, well, it's not fair. I've got to pay him, and I've got to pay taxes for all. And then I say, well, that's the society we live in. We do pay our landlords for the right to live on planet Earth and to run businesses and to go to gyms and all the rest of it on planet Earth. And yet, in addition, we have to pay taxes for all the public services that we enjoy that give that land its value. And that is a fundamental mistake in the economics that we use to run our society today. And all of us should be trying to get our governments to collect land wealth so we don't have to collect our taxes. Yeah. So that's an example of one of the stories. It's so many years now since I've said it, I got it mixed up a bit there. I'm sorry.
Oh, great. Okay, Dave, well, thanks so much for your time. I'll let you know when the podcast's out. If you have a chat with your daughter about getting that picture, or getting hold of the rights to the magazine pictures, and
I'll do that straight away. I'll ring them now while I think about it. I'm a very good person at procrastination.
All right, mate. Thanks for your time, and I hope it all goes well tomorrow.
Yeah. Cheers, Jonathan.
Cheers.
Have fun, mate. Bye-bye.
I sincerely hope you have enjoyed this celebration and tribute to Dave. And I think this second recording of almost an unedited conversation with Dave shows you the kind of guy he was. And also especially how committed he was to making a difference, and how much pride he took in making simple things seemingly, like improving the bus service, but realizing it's got profound importance to the vibrancy and the economic success of a community, but also the societal success of one. And it's something that we forget. One thing that stood out for me when I was at Dave's do, his celebration of his life, was that there were so many people there who were working in politics, who had grown up organizing and fixing problems in their community, and then had almost stumbled into politics, with a capital P, by accident, because it was simply wanting to be of further service to their communities. And the next step was to become a councillor, and after that was to eventually to become an MP. And one of our problems, I think, is we have a group of politicians who have no experience of doing anything political, as in solving problems and working with the bureaucracy and finding a common ground with them and finding a solution that benefits everybody. Some of these people have got no experience whatsoever of doing that kind of work, and it shows. And it shows why they're so incompetent at getting anything done, and that they haven't had to build relationships over years and years, I think tells you why they think they can get away with lying so much. And so it was very poignant to be at that celebration of Dave's life, because there were people there who were utterly integrous and committed to making a difference. And even if my politics didn't match theirs, totally aligned with the shared sense of purpose that we need to make a difference. So thanks very much for this celebration of Dave's life. I hope you enjoyed the almost unedited version, because we're going to miss people like Dave, and there's fewer and fewer of them. Thanks very much.
To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers, and also to buy the books. So until next time, keep reading.